Philadelphia, July 4th, 1776. The air inside the Pennsylvania State House was thick with tension and summer heat. 56 men gathered in that chamber, their names destined to become immortal. John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. History tells us their story. History celebrates their courage. History remembers their signatures on a document that would change the world forever. But history forgot something. History forgot the others, the ones who were there but left no signature, the ones who heard every word but had no voice, the ones who witnessed the birth of a nation that would not recognize their humanity. They were in the room when it happened. They saw it all. And their story has been buried for 250 years. This is not the story you learned in school. This is not the version carved into marble monuments or printed in textbooks. This is the story of the invisible witnesses, the men and women who stood in the shadows while liberty was proclaimed, the enslaved people who served the founding fathers as they declared that all men are created equal. Their names were never recorded in the official proceedings. Their presence was never acknowledged in the historical accounts. But they were there, and what they witnessed would haunt America for generations to come. We know about the signing. We know about the debates. We know about the Declaration of Independence and the revolutionary ideas it contained. But we don't know about the black hands that poured the wine, the black faces that stood against the walls, the black years that heard every word about freedom while wearing chains. This is their story, and it begins not on July 4th, but weeks earlier, when the first drafts were being written and the first arguments were being made. June 1776. Thomas Jefferson sat in his rented rooms on the second floor of a brick house on Market Street. He was 33 years old, a delegate from Virginia, and he had been chosen to write the most important document in American history. But he did not write alone. In the room with him was Robert Hemings, an enslaved man who served as Jefferson's personal valet. Robert was 16 years old. He had been born into slavery on Jefferson's plantation in Virginia, and he had traveled to Philadelphia with his master. While Jefferson wrote about liberty, Robert prepared his clothes. While Jefferson crafted phrases about natural rights, Robert brought him meals. While Jefferson declared that all men are created equal, Robert remained his property. We don't know what Robert thought as he watched Jefferson write those words. We don't know if he felt anger or hope or despair. We don't know if he believed that this declaration would one day free him, or if he understood that it would not. The historical record is silent about Robert's thoughts, but we know he was there. We know he saw the document take shape. We know he was present at the creation of a contradiction that would tear America apart. Robert Hemings was not the only enslaved person in Philadelphia that summer. The city was filled with delegates from across the 13 colonies, and many of them brought their slaves with them. These men and women cooked their meals, cleaned their rooms, tended their horses, and carried their messages. They were everywhere and nowhere, essential to the functioning of the Continental Congress, but invisible in its records. They made the revolution possible, but they would not share in its rewards. George Washington brought several enslaved people with him to Philadelphia. So did Benjamin Franklin, though he had recently begun to question the institution of slavery. Thomas Jefferson brought Robert Hemings, and later his brother James. William Whipple of New Hampshire brought Prince Whipple. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina brought multiple slaves. The Pennsylvania State House, where independence was declared, was surrounded by slavery even as it became the birthplace of liberty. The irony was not lost on everyone. Some delegates recognized the contradiction. Some felt uncomfortable with it, but most accepted it as the natural order of things. Slavery was woven into the fabric of colonial America. It was an economic necessity, they said. It was sanctioned by law and custom. It was, for many of the founding fathers, simply the way things were. And so they wrote a Declaration of Universal Human Rights, while denying those rights to the people who stood in the room with them. On July 1st, the debates began in earnest. The delegates gathered in the assembly room on the first floor of the State House.
It was a large chamber with tall windows that let in the summer heat. Desks were arranged in rows, and the delegates sat in their assigned places, representing their colonies. At the front of the room, John Hancock presided over the proceedings. The enslaved people stood along the walls or waited in adjacent rooms, ready to be called upon if needed. They heard everything, every argument about liberty, every compromise about freedom, every heated exchange about the future of the nation. And they heard the silence where their own freedom should have been discussed. The debates were intense. Some delegates wanted to include a passage condemning slavery in the Declaration. Jefferson had written such a passage in his draft, blaming King George III for the slave trade and calling it a violation of human nature. But the Southern delegates objected. South Carolina and Georgia threatened to leave the Congress if the passage remained. They would not join a revolution that threatened their slave-based economy. And so a compromise was reached. The passage was deleted. Slavery would not be mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. The document that proclaimed all men equal would be silent about the millions who were not considered men at all. The enslaved people in the room heard this debate. They heard their fate being decided. They heard their humanity being negotiated away. And they could say nothing. They had no vote. They had no voice. They could only stand and watch as their masters created a nation that would enshrine both liberty and slavery in its founding documents.
Their names are difficult to find. The official records of the Continental Congress mention delegates, votes, and resolutions. They document debates and decisions. They preserve the words of the men who signed the Declaration, but they rarely mention the enslaved people who made those meetings possible. To find their names, we must look elsewhere. We must search plantation records, estate inventories, personal letters, and account books. We must piece together fragments of evidence to reconstruct their presence, and even then, many remain nameless, ghosts in the machinery of revolution. Robert Hemings we know about because Thomas Jefferson kept meticulous records. Jefferson documented his expenses, and Robert appears in those records as property transported from Virginia to Philadelphia. Jefferson paid for Robert's lodging and food, not as wages but as expenses related to maintaining his property. Robert served Jefferson throughout the summer of 1776, attending to his daily needs while Jefferson attended to the business of revolution. When Jefferson returned to Virginia in September, Robert went with him, still enslaved, still property, despite what the Declaration said about equality. Prince Whipple is another name we know. He was enslaved by William Whipple, a delegate from New Hampshire who would later sign the Declaration. Prince had been born in Africa, captured as a child, and sold into slavery in America. By 1776, he was in his mid-20s and serving as William Whipple's personal attendant. Prince accompanied his master to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress. He was there when independence was declared. He heard the words about freedom and natural rights, and he remained a slave. Years later, Prince would petition the New Hampshire legislature for his freedom, citing the ideals of the Declaration as justification. He would eventually be freed, but not in 1776, not when it mattered most. Billy Lee belonged to George Washington. His full name was William Lee, but everyone called him Billy. He was Washington's constant companion, his personal servant and valet. Billy had been enslaved since childhood on a Virginia plantation, and Washington had purchased him in 1768. By the time of the Revolution, Billy was one of Washington's most trusted attendants. He accompanied Washington to Philadelphia in 1775 and 1776. He was present during the meetings of the Continental Congress. He saw Washington interact with the other delegates. He heard the conversations about independence and liberty, and he knew that none of it applied to him. Washington relied on Billy completely. Billy managed Washington's personal affairs, maintained his uniform and equipment, and attended to countless details that allowed Washington to focus on military and political matters. Without Billy, Washington's effectiveness as a leader would have been diminished. Billy made it possible for Washington to serve as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and as a leading figure in the independence movement. Yet Billy received no recognition, no mention in the historical accounts, no acknowledgement of his contribution. He was property, not a participant. His labor was expected, not celebrated. Then there were the enslaved people who belonged to the Pennsylvania State House itself and to the city of Philadelphia. The building required constant maintenance. Fires had to be lit in winter, rooms had to be cleaned, supplies had to be moved. Some of this work was done by free laborers, but much was done by enslaved people hired out by their owners. These men and women entered the State House daily. They cleaned the assembly room where the Declaration was debated. They maintained the chamber where independence was declared. They were present, invisible, essential. Philadelphia in 1776 was a city deeply connected to slavery despite being in the North.
Pennsylvania still permitted slavery, though a gradual abolition movement was beginning to gain strength. The city's merchants had grown wealthy from the slave trade. Its industries depended on products produced by slave labor in the South. Even Quakers, who were increasingly opposed to slavery, often still owned enslaved people or benefited economically from the institution. The contradiction between revolutionary ideals and the reality of slavery was visible everywhere in Philadelphia that summer. Some of the enslaved people in Philadelphia that summer had been brought from the Caribbean. Others came from southern plantations. A few had been born in Africa and still remembered their homeland. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and came from different cultures. But in Philadelphia in 1776, they shared a common experience. They were present at the birth of a nation that proclaimed freedom while denying it to them. They witnessed history being made while being excluded from it. They saw the future being shaped while having no control over their own futures. The delegates themselves seemed largely unaware of the contradiction, or if they were aware, they rationalized it. They told themselves that slavery was a separate issue, one that could be addressed later. They convinced themselves that declaring independence from Britain was more important than addressing slavery. They argued that unity among the colonies required compromise on the slavery question. They prioritized revolution over abolition, liberty for some over justice for all. And the enslaved people in the room heard these rationalizations and knew they were betrayals. Some delegates felt genuine discomfort with slavery. Benjamin Franklin had owned enslaved people earlier in life, but had come to oppose the institution. By 1776, he was president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. John Adams of Massachusetts had never owned slaves and opposed slavery on principle. Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Sense had helped inspire the independence movement, was a fierce critic of slavery. But even these men did not insist that the Declaration address slavery directly. They accepted the compromise. They agreed to silence on the issue. They chose political expediency over moral consistency. The enslaved people watching and listening understood what this meant. It meant that American independence would not bring their freedom. It meant that the revolutionary rhetoric about natural rights and equality did not apply to them. It meant that they would remain property in a nation founded on liberty. Some may have hoped that the revolution would eventually lead to abolition. Some may have believed that the principles of the Declaration would one day be applied universally. But in July 1776, as they stood in the Pennsylvania State House and watched the delegates debate and vote, they knew that freedom was not coming for them. Not yet. Perhaps not ever.
July 4th, 1776 dawned hot and humid in Philadelphia. The summer heat had settled over the city like a heavy blanket, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, the temperature would only rise as the day progressed, and the assembly room filled with bodies. But the weather did not matter. This was the day that would change everything. This was the day the Continental Congress would formally adopt the Declaration of Independence. This was the day that would be remembered forever. At least, that is what history would record. For the enslaved people present, it was another day of servitude, another day of invisible labor, another day of watching freedom proclaimed for others. The delegates began arriving early. They came from their lodgings throughout the city, some on foot, some on horseback, some in carriages, and with many of them came their enslaved attendants. Robert Hemings arrived with Thomas Jefferson. Prince Whipple came with William Whipple. Others whose names we do not know accompanied their masters. They helped the delegates dismount, tended to their horses, carried their bags and papers. They performed the countless small tasks that allowed the delegates to focus on the momentous business at hand. And then they waited, in hallways, in side rooms, against walls, always present, never acknowledged. The assembly room was arranged carefully for the day's proceedings. Desks stood in rows, each marked for a specific colony. At the front, John Hancock's desk was elevated slightly, marking his position as president of the Congress. The windows were open, hoping to catch any breeze that might relieve the oppressive heat. Inkwells were filled, quills were prepared, documents were arranged. Everything was ready for the historic vote. But first, there would be more debate, there would be more arguments, there would be more compromise. And through it all, the enslaved people would watch and listen. The morning session began with various pieces of business. The Congress dealt with military matters, supply issues, correspondence from the colonies. The Declaration was not immediately brought forward. There were procedures to follow, protocols to observe. But everyone in the room knew what was coming. The tension was palpable. Delegates spoke in hushed tones during breaks. Some were excited, others anxious. A few were still uncertain about the wisdom of declaring independence. Breaking with Britain was not a decision to be taken lightly. It meant war, possibly for years. It meant economic upheaval. It meant risking everything. But it also meant freedom, at least freedom for some. Robert Hemings stood near the door leading to Jefferson's quarters. From there, he could see much of the assembly room. He could watch the delegates as they debated and voted.
He could hear their words, their arguments, their passionate speeches about liberty and tyranny. Did he understand the irony? Did he recognize that the man he served, who spoke so eloquently about natural rights, claimed ownership of him? We cannot know his thoughts. He left no diary, no letters, no recorded words. But he was there. He saw it all. And he must have understood, at least in some way, what it meant. Finally, late in the morning, the Declaration was brought forward. Charles Thomson, the Secretary of the Congress, read the document aloud. His voice carried through the hot, stuffy room. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, the familiar words rolled forth, words that would become sacred to generations of Americans, words about equality and inalienable rights and the consent of the governed. The enslaved people in the room heard these words. They heard that all men are created equal. They heard about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they knew that all men did not include them. There were still objections to parts of the document. Some delegates wanted changes to the language. Others wanted certain passages removed or modified. The debates continued through the afternoon. The heat grew more intense. Flies buzzed through the open windows. The delegates grew irritable and exhausted. But they pressed on, because they understood the importance of what they were doing. They were creating a nation. They were establishing principles that would endure. They were, in their view, serving the cause of human freedom. That their own enslaved servants stood in the room with them. That their proclamation of equality did not extend to these servants, did not seem to trouble most of them. It was simply the way things were. The vote finally came in the late afternoon. One by one, the colonies were called upon to cast their votes. Delaware, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia. One by one, they voted yes. The Declaration was adopted. Independence was declared. The delegates knew they had done something momentous. Some were jubilant. Others were solemn, understanding the gravity of their action. John Hancock reportedly said that they must all hang together, or surely they would all hang separately. It was both a joke and a recognition of the danger they now faced. By signing this document, they were committing treason against the British Crown. If the revolution failed, they would be executed. But what about the enslaved people in the room? What did they think as the vote was announced and the Declaration was adopted? Did they feel hope that this new nation might eventually embrace the principles it proclaimed and free them? Did they feel despair that freedom had been declared for everyone except them? Did they feel anger at the hypocrisy of their masters? Or did they simply feel nothing, numbed by years of enslavement, resigned to their fate? We can only imagine their thoughts, but we know they were there. We know they witnessed this moment, and we know that for them, July 4th, 1776, was not Independence Day. It was just another day of bondage. As the session concluded and the delegates prepared to leave, the enslaved attendants went back to work. They gathered papers, fetched coats despite the heat, prepared horses and carriages. They escorted their masters back to their lodgings. They served dinner, cleaned dishes, prepared beds. The delegates could celebrate their historic achievement. The enslaved people simply continued their labor, as they had before the Declaration, and as they would after it. Nothing had changed for them. Nothing would change for them for a long time to come.
The common belief is that all 56 signers affixed their names to the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. But that is not what happened. July 4th was the day the Declaration was adopted, the day the vote was taken, the day independence was declared. But the actual signing, the moment when John Hancock made his famous bold signature and the other delegates followed, did not happen until weeks later. Most historians agree that the formal signing ceremony took place on August 2nd, 1776. Some delegates signed even later, as they arrived in Philadelphia or returned from other duties. The signing was a process, not a single event. And throughout that process, enslaved people were present, watching, serving, bearing witness. August 2nd was chosen because it took time to prepare the official parchment copy of the Declaration. The document had to be carefully transcribed by hand onto high-quality parchment by Timothy Matlack, an expert penman. The text had to be perfect, the letters precisely formed, the layout elegant and dignified. This was a document for the ages, and its physical form had to reflect its importance. While Matlack worked on the transcription, Congress continued with other business. Military matters pressed urgently. The war with Britain was already underway. George Washington needed supplies, reinforcements, strategic guidance. The delegates dealt with these issues even as they prepared for the formal signing of their Declaration of Independence. When August 2nd arrived, the delegates gathered once again in the assembly room of the Pennsylvania State House. The atmosphere was different from July 4th. The initial excitement and nervousness of declaring independence had passed. Now came the sobering reality of commitment. By signing this document, each man was putting his name to an act of treason,
The penalty for treason was death, typically by hanging. If the revolution failed, these signatures would be their death warrants. Everyone in the room understood this. The mood was serious, almost somber. This was not a moment for celebration. This was a moment for courage. The enslaved attendants were there again, as they had been on July 4th. Robert Hemings attended Thomas Jefferson. Prince Whipple stood ready to serve William Whipple. Others whose names we do not know waited along the walls, prepared to fetch water, deliver messages, or perform whatever tasks their masters required. They had no role in the ceremony itself. They would not sign the document. Their names would not appear on the parchment. But they were witnesses to history nonetheless. They saw each man approach the desk, take the quill, and sign his name. They saw the visible nervousness in some delegates, the grim determination in others, the quiet pride in a few. John Hancock signed first as President of the Congress. His signature was large and bold, clearly legible from across the room. Legend says he wrote it large so King George could read it without his spectacles, though this story may be apocryphal. What is certain is that Hancock's signature became iconic, so much so that John Hancock became American slang for a signature. But as Hancock signed his name with such boldness, did he notice the enslaved people watching him? Did he think about the contradiction between his active defiance against tyranny and his acceptance of human bondage? Probably not. For most of the Founding Fathers, these were separate issues, unrelated questions. They could fight for their own liberty while denying liberty to others without apparent cognitive dissonance. One by one, the delegates came forward. The New Hampshire delegate signed, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. The signatures accumulated, each one another act of commitment to the cause of independence. Some men signed quickly, decisively. Others hesitated, the quill hovering over the parchment before descending. A few delegates made comments as they signed. Benjamin Franklin reportedly said, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." It was the kind of dark humor men employ when facing mortal danger. The threat was real and immediate. British forces were active in the colonies. The war would be long and brutal. Many of these men would lose their fortunes. Some would lose their lives. All would endure years of hardship and uncertainty. But they were fighting for their freedom. They were risking everything for the principle that people have the right to govern themselves, that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are fundamental human rights. These were revolutionary ideas, genuinely radical for their time. The Founding Fathers deserve credit for articulating these principles and risking their lives to establish them. But they deserve criticism too, for limiting those principles, for failing to extend them to all people, for building slavery into the foundation of their new nation. The enslaved people watching the ceremony understood this duality. They could see the courage of the signers. They could recognize the historic importance of the moment. But they could also see the exclusion, the hypocrisy, the injustice. Thomas Jefferson signed the Declaration. The words he wrote about equality and natural rights were beautiful and powerful. But Robert Hemings, standing nearby, was still his property. Jefferson would own Robert for another 18 years before finally freeing him in 1794. And even then, Jefferson would continue to own other enslaved people until his death in 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration was adopted. The Southern delegates signed with no apparent hesitation about the contradiction between their signatures and their slaveholding. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina signed. So did Thomas Lynch Jr., also of South Carolina. Arthur Middleton, another South Carolinian. These men represented a colony whose economy was entirely dependent on slavery. They had no intention of giving up that economic system, regardless of what the Declaration said about equality. They were fighting for their own liberty, for their right to govern themselves without British interference. But they were also fighting to preserve their right to own other human beings. This was the great contradiction at the heart of the American founding. As the afternoon wore on and more delegates signed, the enslaved attendants continued their work. They brought water to refresh the delegates in the August heat. They delivered messages. They stood ready for whatever might be needed. They were essential to the functioning of the Congress, yet completely excluded from its deliberations and its benefits. Their labor made the revolution possible. Their service enabled the Founding Fathers to do their work. But when independence was achieved, it would not be their independence. When liberty was won, it would not be their liberty.
The signing ceremony concluded, and the delegates began to disperse. Some left Philadelphia to return to their colonies, now states. Others remained to continue the work of Congress. The Declaration would be printed and distributed throughout the new nation. Public readings would be held. Celebrations would erupt in towns and cities. The American Revolution had officially begun. But for the enslaved people who had witnessed the signing, life went on much as before. They packed their masters' belongings, prepared for travel, continued their daily labor. The Declaration changed everything for America. For them, it changed nothing. Robert Hemings returned to Virginia with Thomas Jefferson in September 1776. The journey took several days, traveling south through Maryland and into Virginia. Robert rode alongside Jefferson's carriage, managing the horses, handling the luggage, attending to the countless details of travel in the 18th century. When they reached Monticello, Jefferson's plantation in the Virginia hills, Robert resumed his duties there. He served as Jefferson's personal valet, maintaining his clothes, preparing his rooms, assisting with correspondence. He was one of the most privileged slaves on the plantation, if such a term can be used. He worked in the main house rather than in the fields. He had access to education and learned to read and write. He traveled with Jefferson and saw more of the world than most enslaved people ever would. But privilege is relative. Robert was still enslaved. He could not leave. He could not choose his own work. He could not marry without permission. He owned nothing, not even himself. And he knew that the man he served, the man who had written that all men are created equal, saw no contradiction in owning him. Jefferson treated Robert relatively well by the standards of the time. He did not physically abuse him. He eventually trained Robert in valuable skills. But he still owned him, still claimed him as property, still denied him the natural rights Jefferson had proclaimed in the Declaration. Robert lived with this reality for 18 years after the Declaration was signed. He served Jefferson faithfully, traveling with him, managing his household affairs, becoming an indispensable part of Jefferson's life. But all the while, Robert must have thought about freedom. He must have remembered standing in the Pennsylvania State House and hearing those words about equality and inalienable rights. He must have wondered when, if ever, those words would apply to him. Finally, in 1794, Jefferson freed Robert Hemings. The reasons for this decision are not entirely clear. Perhaps Jefferson felt guilt. Perhaps Robert negotiated his freedom. Perhaps circumstances simply aligned to make it possible. Whatever the reason, Robert became a free man at age 34, 18 years after witnessing the Declaration of Independence. But freedom for Robert came at a price. To gain his freedom, Robert had to pay Jefferson a significant sum of money, which he borrowed from his brother-in-law. Even in freeing Robert, Jefferson extracted financial compensation. And while Robert was freed, his relatives remained enslaved at Monticello. His brother James, who would later serve as Jefferson's chef in Paris, would also eventually be freed. But other members of the Hemings family would remain enslaved for decades. Some would only gain their freedom upon Jefferson's death in 1826. Others would be sold to pay Jefferson's debts. The man who wrote the Declaration of Independence died heavily in debt, and enslaved people were liquidated as assets to satisfy his creditors. Prince Whipple's story followed a different path, but ended in a similar place. He returned to New Hampshire with William Whipple after the signing. New Hampshire was a northern state with far fewer enslaved people than Virginia, and the growing abolition movement was stronger there. Prince served William Whipple throughout the Revolutionary War. When William Whipple joined the Continental Army as a brigadier general, Prince accompanied him. They fought together at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, one of the crucial American victories of the war. Prince risked his life fighting for American independence while still enslaved. The irony was profound and painful. After the war ended, Prince Whipple petitioned the New Hampshire legislature for his freedom. His petition was remarkable. He cited the principles of the Declaration of Independence directly. He argued that the same natural rights proclaimed in that document applied to him and other enslaved people. He pointed out that he had fought for American liberty while being denied his own. His petition was eloquent and powerful, and it worked. In 1784, 8 years after witnessing the signing of the Declaration, Prince Whipple was freed. He spent the rest of his life as a free man in New Hampshire, working as a laborer and eventually as a successful merchant. He lived until 1797, long enough to see the new nation establish itself, but not long enough to see slavery abolished. Billy Lee, George Washington's valet, had perhaps the most complicated relationship with his enslaver of any of the people we are discussing. Washington relied on Billy completely. During the Revolutionary War, Billy accompanied Washington everywhere. He was at Valley Forge during the brutal winter of 1777-1778. He was at Yorktown when Cornwallis surrendered in 1781. He managed Washington's personal affairs throughout the war,
handling responsibilities that would have fallen to a senior staff officer if Billy had been free. Washington trusted Billy implicitly and depended on him absolutely. But he still owned him. After the war, Billy continued to serve Washington at Mount Vernon, Washington's plantation in Virginia. The relationship between them was as close as such a relationship could be given the fundamental inequality of master and slave. Washington provided Billy with better clothing and accommodations than most enslaved people received. He allowed Billy certain privileges, but he did not free him. Year after year, Billy remained enslaved even as Washington became the first president of the United States. The man leading a nation founded on principles of liberty and equality kept Billy Lee in bondage. It was not until Washington's death in 1799 that Billy Lee gained his freedom. Washington's will provided for Billy's immediate emancipation and gave him an annual pension for life. Washington also stipulated that all the other enslaved people at Mount Vernon should be freed upon Martha Washington's death. This was unusual. Most of the founding fathers who owned slaves freed few or none of them. Washington at least made provision for their eventual freedom, though it came only after his death and after decades of enslaving them. For Billy Lee, freedom came 23 years after he witnessed the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He spent those years serving the man who led the nation to independence, but who could not extend independence to Billy until death forced the issue.
Robert Hemings, Prince Whipple, and Billy Lee are the fortunate ones in this story. We know their names. We can trace their lives. We can document their experiences, at least partially. But they represent only a fraction of the enslaved people who witnessed the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Many others were there, performing the same essential labor, hearing the same revolutionary words, experiencing the same bitter irony. But their names have been lost to history. They appear in records only as numbers, as inventory items, as generic descriptions. 1 Negro man, 2 Negro women, a slave boy. These anonymous witnesses deserve to be remembered too, even if we cannot name them. The records of the Continental Congress do not list enslaved attendants. Why would they? These people were not considered participants in the proceedings. They were property, equipment, no different from the furniture or the inkwells. The official history of the Declaration of Independence, as written by the delegates themselves and their admirers, simply erased these witnesses from the narrative. It is only by examining peripheral documents, personal correspondence, account books, and estate records that we can confirm their presence and begin to understand their experiences. We know, for instance, that Edward Rutledge of South Carolina brought enslaved people with him to Philadelphia. Rutledge was one of the youngest signers of the Declaration, only 26 years old in 1776. He came from one of South Carolina's wealthiest families, and that wealth was built entirely on slavery. The Rutledge plantations used enslaved labor to grow rice and indigo, crops that generated enormous profits in the colonial economy. Edward Rutledge would have considered it unthinkable to travel without enslaved attendants. His lifestyle required their labor. His comfort depended on their service. But we do not know their names. Rutledge's papers mention servants accompanying him, but they are not identified individually. Were they men or women? How many were they? How old were they? What were their skills and responsibilities? We can make educated guesses based on typical practices of the time, but we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that they were there. They traveled from South Carolina to Philadelphia, a journey of several weeks. They attended to Rutledge during his time at the Continental Congress. They heard him debate the Declaration. They saw him sign it. And then they returned with him to South Carolina, still enslaved. Their presence in history documented only by absence, by silence, by the empty spaces where their names should be. The same pattern repeats throughout the records. Thomas Lynch Jr., another South Carolina delegate and signer, brought enslaved people to Philadelphia. So did Arthur Middleton and Thomas Hayward Jr., also from South Carolina. The South Carolina delegation was particularly dependent on enslaved labor because slavery was so deeply embedded in their society and economy. They could not imagine function without it. But delegates from other colonies brought enslaved people too. Even some northern delegates, from colonies where slavery was less economically central, traveled with enslaved attendants. Consider the daily routine these unnamed witnesses would have followed. They would wake early, before dawn, to prepare their masters for the day. They would light fires, heat water, lay out clothes. They would prepare breakfast or fetch it from nearby taverns. They would ensure everything was ready so that the delegates could focus on the business of Congress. Then, as the delegates departed for the State House,
The enslaved attendants would either accompany them or remain behind to maintain the lodgings. Those who went to the State House would stand and wait, ready to be called upon if needed. Those who stayed behind would clean rooms, wash clothes, prepare meals, run errands. The work was constant and exhausting. In the summer heat of Philadelphia, simply maintaining cleanliness and comfort required tremendous effort. Water had to be hauled, clothes had to be washed by hand and dried, food had to be purchased at markets and prepared over open fires. Firewood had to be gathered even in summer for cooking. Candles had to be made or purchased. The physical labor was relentless, and all of it was performed without compensation, without thanks, without recognition. The enslaved people did this work because they had no choice. Refusal meant punishment. Resistance meant violence. They worked because the alternative was worse. But even in these circumstances, they were not passive victims. Enslaved people have always found ways to resist, to assert their humanity, to maintain their dignity despite the dehumanizing system that confined them. Some resistance was subtle, working slowly, feigning illness, breaking tools, accidentally. Some was more direct, running away, openly defying orders, organizing collective action. We do not know what forms of resistance the enslaved witnesses to the Declaration employed, but it is almost certain that they resisted in various ways. No one accepts enslavement willingly. No one submits without pushback, even if that pushback is invisible to those in power. What we do know is that these unnamed witnesses talked amongst themselves. In the quarters where they slept, in the markets where they purchased supplies, in the streets as they ran errands, they would have discussed what they had seen and heard. They would have talked about the Declaration and its proclamation that all men are created equal. They would have debated what it meant for them. Some might have been hopeful, believing that the revolutionary rhetoric would eventually lead to abolition. Others might have been cynical, recognizing that the white men who spoke of liberty had no intention of extending it to black people. Still others might have been calculating, wondering if the chaos of revolution presented opportunities for escape or resistance. These conversations were dangerous. Enslaved people had to be careful about what they said and who might overhear. White authorities feared nothing more than the possibility of slave rebellion, and any hint of such planning was met with brutal repression. But the conversations happened nonetheless. Information circulated through enslaved communities with remarkable speed and efficiency. The grapevine, as it was called, kept enslaved people informed about events in the wider world. News of the Declaration of Independence would have spread quickly through Philadelphia's enslaved population. They would have heard about it from those who had been present at the State House. They would have discussed its implications. They wondered if it would change anything for them. It did not, at least not immediately. The revolution continued. The war dragged on for years. Enslaved people in Philadelphia and throughout the colonies continued their labor. Some took advantage of wartime disruptions to escape. Some joined the British, who promised freedom to enslaved people who fled from patriot masters. Some fought for the American side, hoping that service would lead to freedom. But most simply endured, hoping that the promise of liberty proclaimed in the Declaration would someday be fulfilled.
The Revolutionary War that followed the Declaration of Independence created chaos throughout the 13 colonies. Military campaigns disrupted daily life. Armies marched through towns and across farmland. Battles destroyed property and killed civilians, as well as soldiers. The economy collapsed in many areas. Food became scarce. Normal social structures broke down. And in the midst of this chaos, enslaved people faced impossible choices. Should they remain with their masters, hoping that American victory would eventually lead to freedom? Should they flee to British lines, trusting British promises of emancipation? Should they try to escape entirely, using wartime disruption to seek freedom on their own terms? There were no good options, only degrees of risk and uncertainty. The British understood that slavery was America's greatest weakness. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved person who escaped from a patriot master and joined British forces. The proclamation was strategically brilliant. It struck at the economic foundation of the southern colonies while simultaneously providing the British with additional manpower. Thousands of enslaved people responded to Dunmore's offer, fleeing plantations and making their way to British camps. They came despite enormous dangers, armed patrols, tracking dogs, severe punishment if caught. They came because the British offered something the American patriots did not, a credible promise of freedom. George Washington was furious about Dunmore's proclamation. He recognized immediately that it threatened both the patriot cause and his own property. Washington owned more than 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon, and he feared they would flee if given the opportunity. He issued orders to his overseers to maintain strict control and to prevent any news of Dunmore's offer from reaching his slaves. But information always finds a way. Enslaved people had their own networks of communication. They knew about Dunmore's proclamation within days of its issuance, and some of Washington's enslaved people did attempt to escape, though most were caught before reaching British lines. The irony was profound. The man who would become the symbol of American liberty, who led the Continental Army fighting for freedom from British tyranny, was simultaneously fighting to keep human beings in bondage. Washington's enslaved workers at Mount Vernon produced the food and supplies that supported his military campaigns. They maintained his estate while he was away at war. They made his leadership of the revolution possible, yet he hunted down those who tried to claim for themselves the liberty he was fighting to secure for white Americans. This contradiction defined not just Washington personally, but the entire American revolutionary project. Other enslaved people who had witnessed the signing of the Declaration faced similar dilemmas during the war. Should they trust the revolutionary rhetoric about equality and natural rights, or should they recognize that rhetoric is hollow, applying only to white men? The answer depended partly on individual circumstances and partly on individual temperament. Some chose to believe in the promise of America and remained loyal to patriot masters. Others saw more clearly and fled when opportunities arose. Neither choice guaranteed freedom or safety. Some enslaved people fought for the American side, serving in the Continental Army or state militias. The exact number is disputed, but historians estimate that between 5,000 and 8,000 black men served in patriot military forces during the Revolution. Some were enslaved men sent by their masters as substitutes, allowing white men to avoid service. Others were enslaved men promised freedom in exchange for enlistment. Still others were free black men who joined voluntarily. They fought in major battles throughout the war: Bunker Hill, Saratoga, Yorktown. They endured the same hardships as white soldiers: hunger, disease, brutal combat, freezing winters. They risked their lives for American independence. But when the war ended, many black veterans found that promises of freedom were not honored. Some masters refused to free enslaved men who had served as substitutes, claiming that the agreement was not legally binding. Some state legislatures passed laws allowing masters to reclaim enslaved veterans. The federal government provided pensions and land grants to white veterans, but often excluded black veterans from these benefits. Men who had fought for American independence found themselves returned to slavery or denied the full benefits of citizenship. The principles of the Declaration of Independence, which they had fought to uphold, were not applied to them. The situation was even worse for those who had fled to British lines. When the war ended with American victory in 1783, the Treaty of Paris included provisions about property. American negotiators insisted that Britain must return all property seized during the war, including enslaved people who had fled to British protection. The British had promised freedom to these refugees, but now they faced pressure to return them to slavery. Some British commanders honored their promises and evacuated black loyalists to British territories: Canada, the Caribbean, even Sierra Leone in Africa. But others betrayed those promises and allowed American masters to reclaim their human property. Thousands of people who had risked everything for freedom found themselves re-enslaved. Consider what this meant for those who had witnessed the signing of the Declaration. They had stood in the Pennsylvania State House and heard the proclamation that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They had watched as 56 men signed their names to this document, committing themselves to these principles. They had seen the revolution fought in the name of these ideals, and then they had watched as those ideals were systematically betrayed, as freedom was granted to white Americans but denied to black Americans, as a nation founded on equality enshrined inequality in its laws and customs. Some of the signers of the Declaration recognized this betrayal. John Adams, who never owned slaves, wrote that slavery was a, quote, foul contagion in the human character, and predicted it would cause enormous trouble for the new nation. Benjamin Franklin, after his conversion to abolitionism, worked to promote gradual emancipation in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. Thomas Paine condemned slavery in the strongest terms and called for immediate abolition. But these voices were in the minority. Most of the Founding Fathers accepted slavery as a necessary compromise, an issue to be dealt with later, a problem for future generations to solve. They convinced themselves that building the nation was more important than securing justice for all its inhabitants. The enslaved witnesses to the Declaration knew better. They understood that there was no separating these issues, that a nation founded on the principle of equality while practicing slavery was built on a fundamental contradiction. They knew that this contradiction would not resolve itself peacefully, that it would poison American society for generations. And they were right.
11 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, the Founding Fathers gathered again in Philadelphia. The year was 1787, and they came to draft a new Constitution for the United States. The Articles of Confederation, which had governed the nation since the Revolution, were proving inadequate. The federal government was too weak. The states were too independent. Commerce was disrupted. Debts were mounting. The experiment in Republican government seemed on the verge of failure. Something had to be done. And so, in May 1787, delegates from 12 states assembled in the same Pennsylvania State House where independence had been declared. Once again, enslaved people were present, serving the delegates, witnessing history. Once again, they would watch as their masters debated freedom while maintaining bondage. George Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention. He arrived in Philadelphia in May, accompanied by several enslaved attendants, including Billy Lee. Washington's presence gave the convention legitimacy and gravitas. If Washington supported the new Constitution, many Americans would support it too. But Washington's presence also embodied the central contradiction the convention would have to address. How could they create a more perfect union, establish justice, and secure the blessings of liberty while preserving slavery? The delegates spent the entire summer of 1787 grappling with this question, and their answer would define American politics for the next 74 years. The debates over slavery at the Constitutional Convention were intense and divisive. Northern delegates wanted to limit slavery's expansion, or at least avoid giving it explicit constitutional protection. Southern delegates insisted that any attempt to restrict slavery would cause them to reject the Constitution entirely. They demanded protections for slavery and concessions that would give slaveholding states political power proportionate to their enslaved populations. The stakes were enormous. Without Southern support, there would be no Constitution, no unified nation. But accommodating Southern demands meant building slavery into the fundamental law of the land. The delegates reached a series of compromises, each one a betrayal of the principles proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. The 3/5 compromise counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. This gave Southern states significantly more representation in Congress than they would have had based on their free populations alone. It also gave them more votes in the Electoral College, which chose the president. Slavery thus shaped American democracy from its inception, giving disproportionate political power to slaveholders. The enslaved people who served the delegates as these calculations were being made knew exactly what was happening. They were being reduced to fractions, to mathematical abstractions used to augment their master's power. The Constitution also included a fugitive slave clause, requiring that enslaved people who escaped to free states be returned to their masters. This nationalized slavery, making it impossible for enslaved people to gain freedom simply by crossing state lines. Every state in the Union, regardless of its own laws about slavery, was now obligated to participate in the capture and return of fugitive slaves. The Underground Railroad would eventually develop to help escaped slaves reach Canada, beyond American jurisdiction, because reaching a free state was no longer sufficient for freedom. The Constitution made the entire nation complicit in maintaining slavery. Additionally, the convention agreed to prohibit Congress from banning the international slave trade until 1808. This gave Southern states 20 more years to import enslaved Africans, ensuring a continuing supply of enslaved labor. Thousands more people would be torn from their homes, transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, and sold into perpetual bondage because the Founding Fathers decided that national union required protecting the slave trade for another 2 decades. The enslaved witnesses to these debates understood that their fate, and the fate of countless others, was being decided by men who spoke eloquently about liberty while denying it to them. Some delegates protested these compromises. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania gave an impassioned speech condemning slavery as a nefarious institution and warning that it contradicted everything the Revolution had stood for. George Mason of Virginia, himself a slaveholder, predicted that slavery would bring judgment of heaven on the nation. But these objections did not prevent the compromises. The delegates convinced themselves that they had no choice, that national union required accommodation with slavery, that the issue could be addressed later. They told themselves that they were being practical, realistic, pragmatic. They were in fact being cowardly. They chose political expedience over moral courage. They chose union over justice, and they embedded that choice in the nation's founding document. The Constitution never uses the word slavery. The delegates could not quite bring themselves to name explicitly what they were protecting. Instead, they used euphemisms. Persons held to service or labor, other persons,
such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit. These contorted phrases reveal the moral discomfort the delegates felt about slavery, even as they constitutionally protected it. They knew slavery was wrong. They knew it contradicted their proclaimed principles, but they protected it anyway because doing otherwise would have required sacrifices they were unwilling to make. The enslaved attendants at the Constitutional Convention heard all of this. They understood what was being done. Some of them had been present 11 years earlier when the Declaration of Independence was signed. They had heard the promises of equality and natural rights. Now they heard those promises explicitly limited, those rights denied to them by constitutional provision. If there had been any doubt about whether the Declaration applied to enslaved people, the Constitution removed it. Enslaved people were property, not citizens. They had no rights that white men were bound to respect. They were fractions of persons for political purposes and wholly persons for purposes of ownership and control. Billy Lee, attending George Washington at the convention, must have felt the crushing weight of this reality. He had served Washington faithfully for nearly 2 decades. He had accompanied Washington throughout the Revolutionary War. He had been present at Valley Forge, at Yorktown, at countless other moments that shaped American history. He had worked tirelessly to support Washington's leadership of the nation, and now he watched as Washington presided over a convention that constitutionally enshrined Billy's bondage. Washington would not free Billy for another 12 years, and even then only in his will, only after death. Robert Hemings had been freed by Jefferson 3 years before the Constitutional Convention, but his freedom had come at a price, and many of his relatives remained enslaved at Monticello. Did Robert hear about the convention and its compromises? Did he understand that the Constitution protected the institution that had imprisoned him for 34 years? Almost certainly he did.
The Constitution was ratified in 1788 and went into effect in 1789. The United States of America became a functioning republic with a federal government, a president, a Congress, and a system of laws. George Washington was inaugurated as the first president. The Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution, guaranteeing freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and other fundamental liberties. America began its experiment in democracy, proclaiming itself a beacon of freedom to the world. But for the enslaved people who had witnessed the founding documents being signed, nothing changed. They remained in bondage. Their children would remain in bondage. Their grandchildren would remain in bondage. The nation founded on liberty had chosen to preserve slavery, and that choice would haunt America for generations. The contradiction at the heart of American founding became increasingly difficult to ignore as the years passed. The Declaration proclaimed that all men are created equal. The Constitution protected slavery. How could both be true? Abolitionists seized on this contradiction, arguing that America had betrayed its founding principles and must abolish slavery to fulfill the promise of the Declaration. Pro-slavery advocates developed elaborate arguments to explain why enslaved black people were not included in the Declaration's proclamation of equality. Some claimed that black people were not fully human and therefore not covered by statements about human equality. Others argued that the founders had intended equality to apply only within racial categories. Still others simply acknowledged the contradiction, but insisted that maintaining the Union required preserving slavery. The compromise that had made the Constitution possible could not last forever. Every expansion of American territory raised the question of whether new states would be slave or free. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to maintain balance by admitting states in pairs, one slave and one free. The Compromise of 1850 tried again to find middle ground, allowing some territories to decide the slavery question for themselves while strengthening fugitive slave laws. But each compromise only delayed the inevitable reckoning. The nation could not remain half slave and half free indefinitely. Eventually, the contradiction would have to be resolved, one way or another. The enslaved people who had witnessed the signing of the Declaration were mostly dead by the time these later compromises were attempted. Robert Hemings died in 1819, a free man but still living in a nation that enslaved millions. Prince Whipple died in 1797,
having gained his freedom but having watched as the Constitution protected slavery. Billy Lee lived until 1828, surviving George Washington by nearly 3 decades and witnessing the intensifying debates about slavery that would ultimately tear the nation apart. But even though these individuals were gone, their descendants remained. The children and grandchildren of enslaved witnesses to the Declaration lived under the system that the Founding Fathers had chosen to preserve. Consider the family of Robert Hemings. His brother James Hemings became Thomas Jefferson's chef, traveling with him to France and learning French cuisine. James was freed by Jefferson in 1796, but the price of his freedom was training another enslaved person to replace him. James lived only a few more years as a free man before dying under mysterious circumstances in 1801. Another brother, Peter Hemings, remained enslaved at Monticello until Jefferson's death, when he was freed at age 58. Other members of the Hemings family were sold to pay Jefferson's debts. Sally Hemings, who had a long-term relationship with Jefferson and bore him several children, remained legally enslaved until Jefferson's death, though she lived in relative freedom at Monticello. Her children were freed, but only because Jefferson was their father. Other enslaved at Monticello had no such advantage. The Hemings family story illustrates how slavery destroyed families and denied human dignity even in cases where individual enslaved people achieved relative privilege. The Hemings were skilled, educated, and in some cases freed. But they were never safe. They were never secure. Freedom for some came only through the continued bondage of others. And even those who gained freedom lived in a nation that denied their full humanity and could revoke their freedom if political winds shifted. This was the legacy of the compromises made in 1776 and 1787. This was the price of preserving national union by protecting slavery. Meanwhile, the enslaved population grew enormously. In 1776, there were approximately 500,000 enslaved people in the 13 colonies. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States. The international slave trade ended in 1808, as the Constitution had permitted, but the domestic slave trade flourished. Enslaved people were bought and sold across state lines, with major markets in Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans. Families were separated. Children were sold away from parents. Husbands and wives were forcibly divided. The interall slave trade was in some ways even more destructive than the international trade, because it deliberately broke apart families and communities that had formed over generations. The cotton boom that followed the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made slavery more economically valuable than ever. The Deep South became a vast cotton-growing region worked by enslaved labor. The wealth generated by cotton enriched not just Southern planters, but Northern merchants, British textile manufacturers, and investors around the world. The global economy became dependent on slavery in the American South. This economic entrenchment made abolition increasingly difficult. Too many people had too much invested in slavery's continuation. The moral arguments for abolition were clear and compelling, but the economic incentives for preservation were powerful. Enslaved people resisted throughout this period. Some resistance was individual, running away, working slowly, feigning illness, breaking tools. Some was collective. Rebellions like Nat Turner's in 1831 shocked the white South and led to even more repressive laws. The Underground Railroad helped thousands of enslaved people escape to freedom in the North or Canada. Abolitionists, both black and white, worked tirelessly to expose slavery's horrors and advocate for its elimination. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, and many others devoted their lives to the cause of abolition. They invoked the Declaration of Independence constantly, arguing that America could never be true to its founding principles while slavery existed. But slavery's defenders also invoked the Constitution, correctly noting that the founding document protected their property rights in enslaved people. They argued that Northern abolitionists were the real radicals, threatening the constitutional order that the founders had carefully constructed. They insisted that each state had the right to decide the slavery question for itself without federal interference. They warned that attempts to abolish slavery would destroy the Union. And when Abraham Lincoln, who opposed slavery's expansion, was elected president in 1860, Southern states made good on that threat. They seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America.
The Civil War began in April 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history. Over 4 years, more than 600,000 soldiers died. Entire cities were destroyed.
Abraham Lincoln insisted that his goal was preserving the Union, not abolishing slavery. He feared that making abolition a war aim would drive border states like Kentucky and Maryland into the Confederacy. Many Northern soldiers were fighting to save the Union, not to free enslaved people. Some were openly racist and would have refused to fight for abolition. Lincoln had to manage these political realities carefully. But enslaved people understood what the war meant regardless of what Lincoln said. They knew that Confederate defeat would mean their freedom, and so they acted on that knowledge. As Union armies advanced into Confederate territory, enslaved people fled to Union lines by the thousands. They sought protection, freedom, and the chance to help destroy the system that had oppressed them. At first, Union commanders did not know what to do with these refugees. Some tried to return them to their masters. Others put them to work for the Union Army, but did not officially free them. General Benjamin Butler coined the term contraband to describe escaped slaves, treating them as property seized from the enemy. It was a legal fiction, but it allowed Union forces to shelter escaped slaves without officially emancipating them. But the flood of refugees could not be stopped, and eventually Union policy changed. In 1862, Congress passed the Confiscation Acts, which freed enslaved people who had been used to support the Confederate war effort. Then, on January 1, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. It did not free enslaved people in border states loyal to the Union, and it had no practical effect in Confederate territory that the Union did not control, but it transformed the war. Now the Union was officially fighting for emancipation, not just for preservation of the Union. The war had become a war to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence. Approximately 200,000 black men served in the Union Army and Navy during the Civil War. Many were formerly enslaved people who had escaped to Union lines and then enlisted. They fought in segregated units under white officers, and they were paid less than white soldiers for much of the war. They faced terrible risks. Confederate policy was to execute or re-enslave black Union soldiers captured in battle, rather than treating them as prisoners of war. Despite these dangers, black soldiers fought with extraordinary courage. They proved their valor in battles like Fort Wagner, Milliken's Bend, and Nashville. They helped win the war that would free their people. The descendants of those who had witnessed the signing of the Declaration in 1776 were among these soldiers. We cannot trace specific genealogical lines with certainty, but we know that the great-grandchildren of Robert Hemings, Prince Whipple, Billy Lee, and countless unnamed witnesses served in the Union forces. They fought to complete the unfinished business of the Revolution. They fought to make real the promises that had been made and broken 87 years earlier. They fought so that the Declaration's words about equality would finally apply to them. The war ended in April 1865 with Confederate surrender. The Union had been preserved and slavery had been destroyed. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, formally abolishing slavery throughout the United States. The institution that the Founding Fathers had protected and perpetuated was finally ended. It took 89 years from the signing of the Declaration to the ratification of the 13th Amendment. It took nearly 600,000 deaths in the Civil War, but the fundamental contradiction of American founding had finally been resolved, at least legally. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, guaranteed citizenship to all persons born in the United States, including formerly enslaved people. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. These Reconstruction amendments attempted to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence by extending its principles to black Americans. For a brief period during Reconstruction, black men voted, held political office, and exercised the rights of citizenship. Black communities built schools, churches, and businesses. It seemed that the revolutionary promise of 1776 would finally be realized. But the promise was betrayed again. Reconstruction ended in 1877 with a political compromise that removed federal troops from the South. White supremacists regained control of Southern state governments. They passed laws that disenfranchised black voters, segregated public facilities, and created a system of oppression nearly as total as slavery had been.
lynching and racial violence enforced this system. The Supreme Court upheld segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, ruling that separate but equal facilities did not violate the Constitution. The gains of Reconstruction were systematically rolled back. Black Americans found themselves free in name, but oppressed in fact. It would take another century of struggle to make meaningful progress toward the equality proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s would finally dismantle legal segregation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 would restore the franchise that had been stolen during Jim Crow. But even these victories did not fully resolve the contradictions of American founding. Racial inequality persists in countless forms: economic disparities, educational inequalities, criminal justice discrimination, housing segregation. The work of fulfilling the Declaration's promise remains unfinished. The enslaved people who witnessed the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 knew that America was making promises it did not intend to keep. They heard the words about equality and natural rights, and they understood that those words excluded them. They watched as the Founding Fathers chose national unity over justice, while the nation.
Today, visitors to Independence Hall in Philadelphia can stand in the room where the Declaration of Independence was signed. They can see the desks where the delegates sat, the chair where John Hancock presided, the space where history was made. Tour guides tell the story of July 4th, 1776, recounting the courage of the Founding Fathers and the revolutionary principles they proclaimed. The room is preserved as a shrine to American liberty, a sacred space in the nation's founding mythology. But something is missing from the story. Someone is missing from the room. The enslaved people who witnessed the signing are rarely mentioned. Their presence is not acknowledged. Their experience is not part of the narrative that visitors hear. This erasure is not accidental. American history has traditionally been told from the perspective of those in power, told as a triumphant moment of liberation, not as a moment when liberation was proclaimed for some while being denied to others. The Founding Fathers are presented as heroes, not as flawed men who courageously challenged British tyranny while cowardly maintaining racial slavery. The complexity and contradiction of the founding moment are smoothed over in favor of a simpler, more comfortable narrative. But history is never simple. The truth is always more complicated than the myths we construct. And the truth about the Declaration of Independence is that it was witnessed by people who were excluded from its promises. Robert Hemings stood in that room and heard Thomas Jefferson read words about equality, while knowing that Jefferson claimed ownership of him. Prince Whipple listened to debates about natural rights, while remaining property himself. Billy Lee served George Washington during the birth of a nation that would not recognize Billy's humanity. Countless others whose names we do not know performed the labor that made independence possible while being denied independence themselves. These witnesses matter. Their stories deserve to be told not as a footnote to the founding, but as a central part of it. The Declaration of Independence cannot be fully understood without acknowledging who was in the room and who was excluded from its promises. The American Revolution cannot be properly evaluated without recognizing that it was a revolution for some, but not for all. The Founding Fathers cannot be accurately assessed without confronting their failure to extend the principles they proclaimed to all people. This does not mean rejecting the founding or dismissing the achievements of the revolution. It means understanding them completely, with all their contradictions and complexities. The enslaved witnesses to the Declaration understood something that many of the Founding Fathers did not: that a nation founded on the principle of equality while practicing slavery was unsustainable. They knew that this contradiction would have to be resolved eventually, that America would have to choose between its proclaimed ideals and its oppressive practices. It took 89 years and the bloodiest war in American history to make that choice. But the choice was inevitable from the moment the Declaration was signed. By proclaiming that all men are created equal, the Founders created a standard by which their own society could be judged and found wanting. The legacy of the enslaved witnesses is not just suffering and oppression, it is also resilience and resistance. They survived an inhuman system. They maintained their dignity in the face of dehumanization. They built families and communities despite efforts to destroy both.
They preserved their cultures, created new forms of music and art and religion, and passed down stories of Africa and of struggle in America. They resisted in countless ways, large and small, and they never stopped fighting for the freedom that should have been theirs from the beginning. Their descendants continued that fight through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights Movement, into the present day. We honor the enslaved witnesses by telling their stories, by saying their names when we know them: Robert Hemings, Prince Whipple, Billy Lee, by acknowledging their presence when we do not know their names, but know they were there, by recognizing that American independence was built on their labor and achieved at their expense, by understanding that the story of America's founding is incomplete and dishonest without including them, by committing ourselves to finally fulfilling the promise of equality that was made in their presence but denied to them. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal. It took nearly 250 years for America to even begin to make that promise real for all its people. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship. The 15th Amendment protected voting rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 enforced the franchise. Each of these was a step toward fulfilling the Declaration's promise. But each came only after tremendous struggle, only after people fought and died for rights that should have been theirs from the beginning. The work continues. Racial inequality persists in America in employment, education, housing, healthcare, criminal justice, and countless other areas. The promise of the Declaration remains unfulfilled, but the promise endures. The words written in 1776 still have power. They can still inspire. They can still call America to be better than it has been, to live up to its proclaimed ideals, to extend liberty and equality to all people. The enslaved witnesses who heard those words understood their power and their potential, even when those around them did not. Their faith that those words would eventually apply to them and their descendants has been partially vindicated. The struggle they began continues. On July 4th each year, Americans celebrate Independence Day. They watch fireworks, attend parades, wave flags, and reflect on what it means to be American. They think about the Founding Fathers and the brave declaration they made in 1776. This is appropriate. The Declaration of Independence is worth celebrating. Its principles are genuinely revolutionary. But the celebration should include the enslaved witnesses. We should remember Robert Hemings, Prince Whipple, Billy Lee, and all the others whose names we do not know. We should honor their presence and acknowledge their exclusion. We should recognize that the promise of the Declaration was made to them too, even if it was denied to them. And we should commit ourselves to completing the unfinished work they began, building a nation that truly extends life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all its people. That would be the most fitting way to honor both the Declaration and those who witnessed it from the shadows. That would be true independence. That would be real freedom. That would fulfill the promise made 250 years ago in a room in Philadelphia where enslaved people stood and listened and hoped and endured.